For decades, the US-Canada relationship was a model of stability and mutual respect, with both nations priding themselves on a peaceful, prosperous border and a shared commitment to open trade. But in early 2025, this partnership was rocked by a sudden and severe trade crisis, sending shockwaves through boardrooms and government offices on both sides of the border. In March, the Trump administration announced a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, justifying the move by citing fentanyl trafficking as a national security threat. The decision was met with disbelief and anger in Canada, where officials argued that the issue was being exaggerated for political gain. The new tariffs were paired with a 10% tax on Canadian energy exports, targeting oil, gas, and electricity. This unprecedented move upended decades of economic cooperation, threatening industries and jobs, and signaling a far more aggressive American posture toward its northern neighbor. The USMCA, painstakingly negotiated to preserve cross-border trade, was suddenly thrown into chaos. Businesses on both sides faced existential threats, with factories idled, supply chains disrupted, and livelihoods at risk. In Ottawa, leaders saw the fentanyl justification as a thinly veiled pretext for forcing Canada into a subordinate role. Heated debates erupted in Parliament, and public outrage grew as the nation's sovereignty was called into question. The tariffs were a blunt instrument, designed to bring Canada to the negotiating table on Washington's terms, directly challenging the country's independence and economic autonomy. Shock quickly turned to resolve across Canada. The government, opposition parties, and ordinary citizens rallied together, bracing for what many feared would be a prolonged and damaging trade war with their closest ally. The border, once a symbol of partnership and trust, now marked the front line of a deepening conflict, one that would test the resilience and unity of both nations in the months to come. As tensions escalated, the true scope of U.S. demands emerged. The Trump administration insisted that Canada grant the U.S. significant influence, potentially even direct control, over key ports and trade policy in exchange for lifting tariffs. This unprecedented ultimatum struck at the heart of Canadian sovereignty, sparking outrage nationwide. Washington argued that North American security required unified control over all entry points, but Canadians saw this as a thinly veiled power grab. For decades, the two countries had cooperated on border security, but this demand went far beyond partnership. Prime Minister Mark Carney faced an impossible choice: surrender sovereignty or risk even harsher penalties. The demand transformed the dispute from an economic spat into a fundamental struggle over Canada's right to self-determination. The nation waited anxiously for its leader's response. Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a decisive response: Canada's sovereignty is not for sale. In a moment that captured the attention of the entire nation, Carney's words echoed through Parliament and across the country, making it clear that Canada would not bow to foreign pressure. Standing before the nation, Carney firmly rejected U.S. demands for control over Canadian ports and trade policy. He emphasized that these demands threatened the very foundation of Canada's independence and self-determination, and that no government could accept such terms without betraying its people. He announced immediate retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of American goods, with plans for more if U.S. aggression continued. These measures were designed not only to protect Canadian industries, but also to send a strong signal that Canada would defend its economic interests at any cost. Canada also bolstered border security, increasing patrols and inspections at key crossings to ensure the safety and integrity of its borders during this tense standoff. The government established a joint strike force to address fentanyl trafficking, exposing the U.S. demands as overreach and demonstrating Canada's commitment to tackling cross-border crime on its own terms. Carney's Stand United Canadians across political lines, rallying public support for a firm defense of national independence. Citizens from coast to coast voiced their approval, with rallies and demonstrations in support of the government's tough stance. The government's calculated risk signaled that Canada would not be bullied, even at great economic cost. Officials weighed the potential fallout, but stood resolute, believing that defending sovereignty was worth any sacrifice. The message to Washington was clear: Canada is a partner, not a subordinate. Any future negotiations would have to respect that fundamental principle. The economic fallout was uncertain, but the political victory was immediate. Markets wavered, but the sense of national pride surged, as Canadians saw their leader standing tall on the world stage. Now the ball was in America's court. The world watched closely, waiting to see how Washington would respond to Canada's bold and unwavering stand. The trade dispute erupted into a full-scale tariff war. By September 2025, the U.S. raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%, with 50% duties on steel and aluminum, and 25% on cars and trucks. Canada retaliated, targeting U.S. products from politically sensitive districts to pressure American lawmakers. Legal challenges to the tariffs created uncertainty, but the duties remained in place, trapping businesses in limbo. The cost of goods soared for consumers and companies in both countries. Tariffs on trucks alone threatened to add $35,000 to new vehicle prices, hitting small businesses hard. The economic pain was widespread, with ordinary families and companies bearing the brunt. The conflict was no longer abstract. It was a daily reality for millions. The longer the standoff dragged on, the greater the damage to North American prosperity. The trade war devastated North America's integrated economy, with autos and energy hit hardest. Once seamless cross-border operations were thrown into chaos, as companies scrambled to adapt to new rules and mounting costs. Canadian car exports to the U.S. faced crippling tariffs, threatening jobs and making vehicles uncompetitive. Plants that once ran at full capacity now faced layoffs and production slowdowns, as uncertainty rippled through the industry. The energy sector, vital to both nations, was disrupted by a 10% U.S. tariff on Canadian oil. This not only hurt Canadian producers, but also raised prices for American consumers and refineries, straining a partnership built over decades. Internal divisions surfaced as Alberta refused Ottawa's request to raise levies on oil exports, exposing regional rifts. Tensions grew between provinces and the federal government, complicating efforts to present a united front. Steel and aluminum, key Canadian exports, faced 50% U.S. tariffs, raising costs for American manufacturers and hurting both economies. Factories on both sides of the border struggled to absorb the shock, with some forced to shut down or relocate. 1/3 of U.S. manufacturing inputs come from Canada or Mexico, showing how self-defeating the tariffs could be. The deeply interconnected supply chains meant that disruptions in one country quickly spread to others, magnifying the impact. The freight and logistics industry reeled from uncertainty, with a freight recession deepening as businesses delayed investments. Warehouses sat empty, and transport companies faced mounting losses as cross-border trade slowed to a crawl. Temporary surges in U.S. port activity gave way to long-term disruption and decline. The initial rush to beat tariffs was quickly replaced by a sharp drop in shipments, leaving ports and workers in limbo. The intricate web of North American supply chains was unraveling, with consequences that could last for years. As industries struggled to adjust, the true cost of fractured trade ties became painfully clear. Confronted with U.S. hostility, Canada accelerated efforts to diversify its trade and reduce dependence on its southern neighbor. In 2024, 76% of Canadian exports went to the U.S., giving Washington enormous leverage. The expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline allowed Canadian oil to reach Asian markets, breaking the American monopoly. Canada shipped a record $2 billion in crude to China, signaling a new direction. However, USMCA's China clause restricts Canada's ability to sign free trade deals with non-market economies, limiting its options. Canada also reviewed its planned F-35 fighter jet purchase and strengthened defense ties with allies like Australia. The strategy: build a network of partnerships to counterbalance U.S. influence. Diversification was now a matter of national security. The U.S. trade war isn't Canada's only security challenge. Russia and China have launched cyber attacks, stolen intellectual property, and weaponized trade against Canada. In February 2025, Russian hackers targeted Canada's energy and defense sectors, part of a persistent digital threat. China's past tariffs on Canadian canola cost farmers billions, highlighting the risks of economic dependence on authoritarian regimes. In response, Ottawa named over 100 Chinese, Russian, and Iranian institutions as security threats and restricted sensitive research funding. Canada's economic and national security are now inseparable, requiring vigilance on multiple fronts. The fight to protect Canadian interests is more complex than ever. Beneath the headlines, the trade war's real impact is felt by ordinary people. Canadian families face higher prices for food, clothing, and essentials, while workers fear layoffs and plant closures. American consumers and businesses are also hurting, with tariffs making goods more expensive and exports harder to sell. The conflict has turned a once beneficial partnership into a zero-sum game, with both sides losing. As of October 2025, tariffs remain, and diplomatic channels are strained. Carney's firm stand has united Canadians, but the US shows no sign of backing down. The hope for a quick resolution has faded, replaced by a grim new normal. The future of the US-Canada relationship hangs in the balance, with trust and supply chains badly damaged. The next moves by leaders in Ottawa and Washington will shape North America for generations.